There's a truth modern people often overlook. In a medieval winter, walls weren't just barriers against wind and rain. They were the final boundary between life and that seemingly harmless 40-degree cold. Poor peasants had no fine stone, no massive timber, and certainly no grand fireplaces. Yet they possessed an invention that still amazes archaeologists today. Earthen walls made from soil, straw, and animal dung that could hold heat like a natural machine. They mixed damp clay with finely cut straw to form a fiber framework, then added animal dung to increase binding strength and slow heat loss. When this mixture was packed onto wooden frames, it dried into a thick, heavy armor so dense that cold winds simply slid over it without breaking through. During the day, the walls absorbed whatever rare warmth they could, from weak sunlight or from the hearth fire. At night, they released it back in small pulses, like the slow breathing of the house itself. No one at the time called it science, but every family knew. Get the ratios wrong, or build the wall too thin, and the whole house would shiver until dawn. The more we revisit these ancient methods, the more we realize our ancestors understood far more than we imagine. And if this invention already surprises you, ask yourself, among the 7 secrets, which one do you want me to reveal in depth in the next video? If you stepped into a medieval house during a 40-degree winter, the first thing that would surprise you wouldn't be the cold. It would be the thin veil of smoke floating just below the ceiling. Today, we think smoke indoors means bad engineering, but for medieval people, it was an intentional thermal blanket, an invisible layer created on purpose. They knew that without a chimney, the heat from the fire stayed inside, gathering into a warm pocket of air that hovered above and kept the whole space from losing precious warmth. That smoky layer warmed the wood, dried the thatched roof, prevented moisture, drove away insects, and even helped hanging meat cure faster. But most importantly, it formed a stable heat zone that every family depended on during long nights. The interesting part is they didn't need to understand convection physics. They only needed to observe, experiment, and learn from hundreds of winters that had exhausted entire villages. And looking back, we realize what seemed primitive was actually a refined strategy sharpened across generations. If you've ever wondered how houses without chimneys could stay warm enough for a family to survive the night, that suspended layer of smoke is the answer. In surviving medieval houses, there's one detail that often makes modern visitors chuckle. The door is so small you practically have to fold yourself in half to get inside. But what they don't realize is that a medieval house didn't just have a door. It contained a wind control mechanism, so precise that modern researchers have had to rethink their entire understanding of folk architecture. Because in 40-degree weather that seems mild, but comes with cutting wind and high humidity, a door facing the wrong direction could drain a home of all its warmth in just minutes. Medieval people discovered that the north wind carried the harshest cold, so they turned their doors toward the east or southeast to catch the morning sun and avoid direct cold drafts. And the low door height? Not because they lacked timber, but because reducing the open area was the key to limiting how much heat escaped. Open the door too wide after dark, and the warmth stored in the earth and straw walls would be sucked out so fast that children had to be held close to the hearth to avoid sudden cold shock. Here's the twist. Some homes even built their door sills intentionally high, above ankle level, forcing anyone entering to slow down, reducing the rush of cold air pushed inside by momentum. It wasn't an inconvenience. It was airflow engineering without a single physics formula. Looking at the way they fought winter winds using nothing but doors and orientation, we realize our ancestors treated architecture as a survival weapon. And the next time you see some medieval detail that seems poor, try commenting. Could it be hiding a technique we've accidentally forgotten? If the walls kept warmth along the sides of the house, the quietest enemy lay right under their feet, the damp, freezing ground, a giant sheet of cold metal constantly pulling heat out of the body. Modern people can turn on heated floors, but medieval peasants had only one option: to create an insulating layer from materials everyone else considered worthless. They began by compacting the first layer of soil to reduce moisture, then spreading a thin layer of fine ash on top. Ash might sound crude, but it was the perfect natural moisture shield, absorbing water while blocking cold from rising. The final step was mixing chopped straw or crushed bark into diluted clay and packing it into a palm-thick surface. Once dry, it wasn't soft, it wasn't warm, but most importantly, it didn't steal human body heat the way bare earth did. What surprised archaeologists is that in many regions, medieval people even added sawdust, seaweed, or shredded flax to increase elasticity and trap air inside the floor layer. Those tiny pockets of air were the secret that kept the ground 1 degree warmer than the soil outside. If today we look at that floor and see nothing but dried mud, they saw a shield against weeks of lingering 40-degree hot cold. And you might agree, sometimes the things that protect us most come from materials we no longer even consider worth noticing. In modern eyes, letting livestock sleep close to the living space looks like a sign of poverty. But for medieval peasants, it was a carefully calculated natural heating system. Cows, goats, and horses constantly radiate heat. A single adult cow can produce as much warmth as a small charcoal stove that never goes out. So they built their homes with 2 connected sections: the human living area and the livestock stall, separated only by a thin wall of earth or wood, so the heat could pass steadily and safely into the sleeping quarters. On cutting cold 40-degree squares nights, warmth from the animals drifted through the wooden slats and mixed with the heat from the ash bed, forming a hot air zone that kept the entire family from suffering sudden drops in temperature. What's remarkable is that this setup didn't appear by accident. It evolved over generations. In some regions, they even raised the livestock floor higher than the sleeping area, so the hot air would naturally flow downward like a miniature convection system. Archaeologists call this shared heat design, but to medieval people, it was simply the only way to make sure no warmth was wasted during a long winter. And the more we understand this strategy, the more we see our ancestors' sharp intuition. They didn't keep livestock just for milk or meat. They kept them for their heat, a life-saving resource we rarely even think about today. In Northern and Central European folktales, people often mention the fire that never dies overnight as a symbol of luck. But what few understand is that behind that layer of myth lies a survival technique medieval families practiced every single winter night. They didn't burn a big roaring fire and let it fade. Doing that only made the firewood disappear faster than the cold. Instead, they built small earthen stoves, thick and heavy like a turtle shell, able to absorb and retain heat for hours. When cooking was done, they didn't extinguish the flames. They covered the largest embers with fine ash, turning them into sleeping coals, slow, red, and steady, almost breathing in rhythm with the house. Experienced families knew which wood to choose. Slow-burning, dense-core logs that held heat longer. A properly buried ember could survive until morning, needing only a single breath to ignite the fire again. For medieval people, keeping embers alive overnight meant saving half a day of chopping wood, and sometimes preventing children from waking up chilled in the middle of the night. What surprised researchers is that in many places, the floor and walls around these earthen stoves show clear patterns of heat cycling, proving that medieval people used the stove as a thermal battery rather than just a cooking tool. This technique is far more sophisticated than its crude appearance suggests. And if you ever thought medieval life lacked science, this might be the moment to reconsider. Now that you've heard it, what impresses you most? The earthen stove, the sleeping coals, or the way they turned ash into a temperature control tool? Share your thoughts. Your comment might spark the next episode. When people think of medieval winters, many imagine peasants throwing on a random thick animal hide and simply enduring the 42 degrees of wind. But the truth is far more sophisticated. They didn't fight the cold with clothing. They fought it with a system, something we'd now call the multi-layer principle. Yet their ancestors mastered it centuries before any scientific book existed. The heart of that system was vadmal, a wool fabric woven extremely thick, then beaten, fulled, and compressed until the fibers locked tightly together, forming a material that was almost windproof. With vadmal worn on the outside, they added a thin wool layer underneath to trap air pockets and a linen layer closest to the skin to absorb moisture, keeping the body dry. An essential detail, because just a few degrees lower and the cold would seep straight into the bone. The climax is this. Modern experiments show that vadmal is wind-resistant enough to rival some lightweight jackets today, meaning that without industrial technology, they created a material with thermal performance far beyond what we imagine from a poor era. Strangely, they never called it an invention. It was simply something they had to make to stay alive. And if you ever thought medieval clothing was only symbolic, it might be time to rethink it. Sometimes the simplest looking thing is the strongest layer of protection they ever had. On a damp 40-degree fire's night, when the earthen walls had released their last bit of warmth and the hearth held only a few glowing, sleeping embers, the survival of a medieval family didn't depend on blankets or fire. It depended on the way they slept, not casually, not randomly, but through a strategy passed down for generations, the heat cluster. They raised their beds off the ground to avoid the cold air layer that hovered near the floor, then placed children and the elderly in the center, where everyone's body heat gathered most evenly. The stronger adults lay around them, forming a living ring of warmth, a breathing furnace with a clear structure. Some households even added dry straw or shredded flax beneath the bedding to hold heat longer, turning the bed into a second layer of insulation parallel to the floor. The climax lies here. Medieval people understood that even shifting slightly out of the cluster meant the outward-facing side of their back would absorb cold. So quickly, it could keep them from falling asleep again. So they didn't just sleep to rest, they slept as a ritual of uniting the family's warmth. Looking back, it becomes clear. In a world without conveniences, they turned closeness itself into the most efficient natural heating technology. And it makes you wonder, How many simple survival techniques have we forgotten? In a medieval winter, cooking wasn't just about having dinner. It was a strategic equation between food, fuel, and the family's survival. Modern people can fill a pot with water and boil it freely, but for medieval peasants, adding one more bowl of water meant burning one more bundle of firewood. And a single bundle of firewood could decide whether the family stayed warm through the night. That pressure created a technique that sounds almost mythical: cooking without water, or using as little as possible. They heated large stones inside the earthen stove, then dropped them into a pot filled with meat, roots, and aromatic leaves. The heat radiating from the stones cooked the food slowly without needing constant boiling. As the fire faded, they sealed the pot with a tight clay lid to trap natural pressure, turning the entire meal into a living heat container that stayed hot for 6 to 8 hours with nothing but a handful of glowing embers. If the technique was done wrong, the heat escaped too fast, the food spoiled, the wood was wasted, and the whole household faced a colder night. Here's where the drama lies. On stormy nights, some families had enough wood to cook only once, so that single stew pot was both dinner and the last source of heat for the entire house. The longer the dish retained warmth, the better their chances of sleeping safely. And looking back, we see something clear. Our ancestors didn't just know how to cook, they knew how to control heat, with techniques so refined they leave many modern people stunned. What do you think? Was this wisdom or a forgotten genius? There's a truth anyone who studies medieval life eventually encounters. Winter wasn't a cold season. It was a months-long examination, a test in which every family had to prove they were wise enough to survive one more year. And when we look back at those 7 seemingly crude inventions, the heat-holding earthen walls, the smoke layer beneath the roof, the small wind-avoiding doors, the ash and straw floors, the warmth from livestock, the earthen stove and sleeping embers, the multi-layered clothing, the heat cluster sleeping method, and the waterless cooking technique, we finally understand that they didn't defeat winter through strength, but through observation and the ability to turn tiny details into weapons of survival. The light hook sits here. If a medieval family lost just one of these techniques, sometimes a single night was enough to exhaust them. That fragility turned every detail into a piece of a survival system far more sophisticated than modern people imagine. And the twist is, most of these secrets were never lost. They simply hid inside habits we no longer pay attention to. What saved them wasn't fire or wood. It was their ability to recognize the value of things we now consider insignificant. And if you were placed in a 40-degree medieval night with no electricity, no glass windows, no fireplace, how long do you think you could endure? Share your thoughts. Your perspective might inspire the next chapter in this exploration of medieval survival. And if you'd like to keep unraveling these hidden secrets with me, this place will always be here waiting for you.